Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Story of a Storyteller. And my guest today is Chelsea Callahan. How are you, Chelsea?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Chelsea is the author of, a poet who has a book, a series of poetry called Wordplay, and then the Devereaux. Am I saying that right? Devereaux
Yeah.
Witches. Yes, and a series of books and short stories, all featuring the Devereaux Witches. And we're going to get into all that in due course. But first, Chelsea, I always like to start with questions of how you kind of started. And I noticed in your Amazon bio and on your website, you said that you're the youngest in your family and also the youngest in the area you grew up in your neighborhood. So what's it like to be the baby in your whole neighborhood?
Well, the funny part is I'm the baby on my mom's side of the family. On my dad's, I'm towards the top of 18
Oh,
different
wow.
kids. Yeah, it was a big family. But I didn't really see them much, so I was always the youngest. And I have five cousins on my mom's side, all of them older than me by at least 2 years.
Okay.
So it was just kind of like, yeah, you're the little cousin, you stay over there. And then when they weren't around, which was rare, but it happened from time to time, um, it just became me hanging out in my town, and the closest person in age to me was either the little girl who lived across the street who was at least 4 years younger than me, or my neighbor who was a junior in high school at the time when I was in middle school. So I was just like that little kid tagging around with the big kids who's like, let me play too.
Yeah. It's like you were saying, let me play. And they were like, we're not playing though. We're just hanging out. Like,
Exactly. We're just sitting here.
yeah. It's funny you say that about cousins. My other half, he's in the same situation. So in his mother's side of the family, he was the first grandchild.
Mm.
So he was the oldest cousin. But then on his father's side of the family, he's one of the youngest. So he actually has first cousins that are grandparents and first cousins that are like, how old is that cousin now? He's like 5 or 6. So it's this weird spread in ages, and he's just like bang right there in the middle.
Yeah, on my dad's side, I'm probably like like if you're going from oldest to youngest, I'm fifth in line. And if
Fifth in
you
line.
go from
It sounds like your grandfather is gonna was a king or something.
yeah, but hey, the way they act, maybe.
Okay.
Um, but there's so many of them, and one of my uncles is young enough that he's still having kids,
Hmm.
so they're just adding to that number. So it's like, hey, next time I see you, they're just going to be somebody else calling me aunt or cousin, and I'm not going to know who you are. And on top of that, all the other cousins, they're having kids, they're getting married. So I see pictures pop up on their Facebooks and stuff like that. And I'm like, who is
Which one
that?
is that? Yeah, I
I
know exactly what you
I
mean.
felt so bad. I had to ask one of my cousins who I actually like I talk to more often, because she put on a whole bunch of pictures from Christmas. And I'm looking at this one picture. I'm like, I know that kid. And I know that one. Who's the one in the middle? So I had to ask her. And she says, oh, that's little Mackenzie. And I'm like,
Ah,
oh.
yeah. I'm kind of going through the same thing, except it's not new cousins. It's because I'd be kind of in the younger third on both sides of the family in terms of cousins, and I have 29 cousins on one side and 16 on the other.
Oh,
And
wow.
oh yeah, and that's nothing compared to my other half. He is like, I don't even know. We're together 12 years. I still haven't met all his cousins. It's insane. But some of my oldest cousins are now having children of their own. So now they're second cousins. And I'm like, I know we're related, but I have no idea who your name is. I don't even know who your parents are, but hi.
You know, we're family, but that's about
That's
it.
as far as I go. We're family, and that's where I draw the line. Um, so I always as well go on to the beginning of my guest's relationship with story. And I know that um, you have a kind of a complicated relationship, to put it mildly, with story and particularly reading and writing. So, and it's interesting because I've I've had guests and I've heard it said many times that to be a good writer, you need to be a voracious reader. Um, and it's not something I necessarily believe. I think you have to have a good appreciation of story, not necessarily be a heavy reader. So so I know that wasn't the case with you because of dyslexia. So what's your relationship with reading stories like?
Well, when I first, because it was a while ago. Wow. Um,
Did you
when
just do
I
the maths
first,
in your head and we're like, oh, that's
yeah, I
good?
was just trying to. I was like, I like when I first started in school, I didn't like reading. And at the time, I didn't know why. I would get my reading homework, and back then they had those big, thick, like language arts textbooks
Hmm.
where they had like pages and pages of short stories, which at the time felt impossibly long. And you'd get your assignment, you'd have to read X amount of pages or this story, and you'd go through it. And but I always hated doing that because it just felt so like hard.
Hmm.
And it didn't necessarily feel like I couldn't do it. It just felt like I was sitting there trying to like get through it, and it was just complicated.
Hmm.
And then as I started getting older, I started realizing that there was an actual problem because between reading and spelling and like even math in some cases, it just my processing of it wasn't there.
Hmm.
So in I think it was second grade, one of the school noticed I was having difficulties and they got the school psychologist, or it's like school educational psychologist,
Yeah.
forget what the exact title was, to observe and evaluate me. And that's when they came out and they're like, well, she's dyslexic. Because at the time they thought I had ADHD, which, based on the way I think now, I'm pretty sure it's a case of both.
Okay.
But because of how I process things and I work, it's complicated. but, and so with my dyslexia, it just became like I finally had a name for why I was struggling.
Yeah.
So, in order to, when I started making that transition from being the kid who liked science and liked history, because those were the things that didn't require,
A ton of reading.
yeah, they were like, I memorized my dates, I memorized my scientific facts. I was golden. And I just find it so funny thinking back, like, yeah, science used to be my favorite course. And now everybody talks to me in scientific terms, and I'm just like deadpan.
Yeah.
And I have no idea. And so it was just one of those things where it was just like it slowly started to happen. And I think in large part it was because of my mom. She would take me to the movies.
Hmm.
And like you're saying, stories, it's not always reading
Hmm.
stories that get you into it. For me, it was movies, it was watching film. And I think I was probably 4 or 5 the first movie she took me to. And the way she put it, she said there was kids running up and down the aisles in it, and I just sat there staring up
Wow.
at the screen. And it's always how it's been for me. I love getting into a theater and just letting everything go and just watching.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting sucked
It,
in and getting like
mm,
absorbed. Yeah.
and it like it was a bit of an obsession growing up for me because I always loved seeing characters act out these different things. And oh, my brain eventually just started putting myself in there because I wanted, like, it was that like the birth of escapism for me,
Yeah. Okay.
because between the things I was dealing with at school, it became that place where I could, for a moment in my head, imagine being in a different body, being in a different situation, being able to handle anything that came my way. And then as that progressed, it became not just imagining myself there, but like, how would I put a character in that story? Like, what kind of person would I see walking around in there? And it just became like this place for me to play with my imagination, and I just fell in love with it. And then stories became reading stories, and my mom would take me to the library, and it always reminds me of a Tree Grows from in Brooklyn, where the parents were reading, I think, Shakespeare and the Bible to the girl. And because I don't think my mom had any idea of this at the time, but she let me walk around the library, and I found a children's edition of Shakespeare. And she started reading me Romeo and Juliet. And she would, like, I'd ask her, like, what does that even mean when they're talking? And she'd explain it the best way she could. And that was really the trigger for me to start looking at books and trying to, like, fight against that problem that just kind of stopped me.
Mm.
And I mean, looking at my desk right now, I've got no less than 30 books stacked up around my computer. And so it's like, thinking about that now, it's such a journey from actually hating reading because I just couldn't do it, to it being one of my favorite things to do.
Mm. So I'm not sure if you know, but I'm a teacher in my other life, to put it, to not find the point in it. And I actually have taught and still do teach quite a lot of dyslexic children. And it's very interesting to see, like, to people not in education, or to people who haven't experienced dyslexia directly or indirectly through a family member or whatever, a lot of people think it's just you can't spell right or reading's hard, but it's so much more than that. I mean, there's yeah, there can be letter reversals that you that easily like, I used to think it was like you couldn't tell the difference between like B and D and P and Q, but it's not. It's, for some people, it's the letters actually float and move around on the page. Look, I'm even sorry, I'm such a teacher. That's how I do the B and the D to show them. And I'm like, there's a bed, and if you look at it, it's like BED. So that's why. Oh God. Anyway, but there's so much more, isn't there? I mean, there's like even composing and coming up with the sentences and the word structure in the right order, and memorizing things, even sequencing, in terms of like step one, you put the bread in the toaster, step two, you press the button, step three, like, I know that's very, very basic, but to even write that down can be difficult, especially for younger people with dyslexia. So what were the main kind of, how did your dyslexia affect you around the time that you were assessed?
At the time, it was more that my it wasn't, it's hard to put in words, but it wasn't so much that like letters were floating around or anything like that. It was when I read them, the processing of them it was almost like there's a disconnect between me seeing it and what my head is telling me it says.
Yeah.
And so I would have to sit there and go, that's what that is. That's
Well,
that.
could you, for example, like if the sentence was the cat sat on the mat, you could read that no problem. But if you were then asked what sat on what, you'd be like, was it
My
like
head
that?
would flip them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I'd have to sit there and like every like processing moment of it, I'd have to actually sit there and think about it, or I'd get it all jumbled, or I'd put it in the wrong order, or I would just be like, something sat on the mat. What was it? And I just would lose that piece.
Yeah.
And it was unbelievably frustrating.
Oh, I see it every day. Like and it's a shame because it's like, even the way you were talking about film and stuff there, and there's children I've taught that have experienced this. I always say that there's some kids who get dyslexia that they're bookworms really at heart, but because of dyslexia, they can't access the thing that they love. So it's an awful shame when you see people that would love reading, but there's something stopping them.
It stops them. Yeah.
Yeah. And what then? So you said it was like the school that kind of highlighted the issues and everything like that. Was there any kickback or anything like that with your mum? I believe she was supportive, and your family, were they kind of, because like you and I are roughly the same age. Dyslexia at a time when we were kids was like, oh God, no, that's a bad thing. That's a,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, my dad at the time, he, my parents got, oh gosh, was it that year? Or, it was right around the time my parents were getting divorced that all of this kind of happened.
Mm,
And my dad was never one to accept something like a disability. So he, anytime I was struggling with homework or something, and he would try and help me, it often became him yelling or like getting frustrated, and he couldn't cope with how to handle it, and putting on a name on it
mm,
just gave me a label that he didn't want to acknowledge.
mm,
And then, but my mother, she's always been my number one person. She's always been in my corner, and she would always try and take it slowly with me and try and walk me through it, help me memorize things. And I mean, to the point where she and I would sit for hours on spelling tests when they were coming up. We'd have our list of words and we'd go through. She'd quiz me over and over. Tell me how to spell this. Tell me how to spell that. Tell me how to spell this one. I would know them backwards and forwards at home.
mm.
By the time I got to that test
Yeah.
and seeing them on the page without her reading them to me or hearing the word from her, I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I'd get some of them right, and the ones that I really like tried to get stuck in my brain. But then you get the more complicated words, and it's just like, this is gibberish to me. So it wouldn't process, and I wouldn't be able to hold that piece of what I wanted in my head. So it just went right through my fingers. So it was really two sides of the same coin. I had the bad side with my dad, and then my mom, who worked with me and really, because she saw how hard it was. She knew
Mm,
what I struggled with, and she really took her time to understand the problem and make sure that I was comfortable with what I was doing. She never put on pressure on me about, you got to get better grades, you got to do this, that, you got to study more. It was more about, let's do the work. We'll make sure you do it right and you'll get it done. And that's what's important.
yeah.
And
And it's funny
she,
because like now, sorry to cut across, but just because it seemed there, your mum put a lot of work in and everything with spelling in particular. I'm
mm,
sure she did lots of other things. It sounds like she did do a lot of work with you. But just when you mentioned spelling, it's so funny because now, I mean, and if my principal is watching, I don't really think this, but I do. Does spelling matter anymore? Really? I mean, we have autocorrect and we have spell check and we have Grammarly and you have pro writing aid, and all these things are built into, like, the main way we communicate is typing and screens and things like that, and all those things have spell checkers embedded in there. So I mean, if you can get everything except spelling right, the computer brings you the rest of the way.
yeah, well, it,
Well,
it
for an
almost
evening.
does.
It's not perfect, I know that.
I, I, it's funny you say it because one of my biggest regrets about the books that I've put out is that I didn't edit them enough,
Mm,
because spelling even today is a huge problem for me. It's
yeah.
like know the word in my head, but by the time I try and write it out, it just I'll either put the letters all mixed up, might all be the right letters, but they're
It's
all
not the
out of
right
order.
order.
Yeah, and or I won't know it. It just won't have a place in my head where what is that? And I'll do my best guess because that was essentially what my school solution for me was for the longest time was just get it as close as you can and you're fine.
Yeah.
And which helped in the sense that it meant that I didn't get marked down every time I made a mistake. But at the same time that didn't teach me anything.
Mm.
It didn't get me to correct my mistake. So I just became the habit of sounds this way, so I'm going to stick with that word. And then somebody would go, actually, it's spelled this way. Okay, I messed up. Let me fix it. But when you have teachers who are just like, okay, it's spelled wrong, but let it go. And it's, for me, that is great to do that for a kid, is to understand where they're coming from and why that mistake's there. But in order, I wish, like, based on my books now with all the errors that I see in it, when I go back and I look at it again and I say, oh, yeah, that's spelled wrong. Oh, that's form instead of from.
Yeah.
And like those little things, if, like, I just wish somebody had caught them when I was learning
Mm.
and starting to become the writer I am today. Because if they had and maybe started me towards correcting those problems, I may have been able to produce a better edited book. And maybe more people would be buying it or some like logical step in my head.
But in your defense, though, I don't think anybody can really edit their own book, like dyslexic or not. I mean, I, I mean, obviously, someone with dyslexia will have a harder time of it due to things like you said, like spelling from instead of form, because it's spelled like Word. We'll say Microsoft Word spell checker won't catch that. You know, there
Exactly.
are other more complicated software that would, but I don't think like editing is so much more than that anyway, you know. But it
Mm.
like what we're talking about there when you say editing, that's really copy edit. That's, you know, dotting your i's and crossing your t's and capitalizing the start of the sentence. Da, 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 da. So no, nobody can do that because as a writer that created it, you're there's a, I don't know if this is a phrase in the States, but here we'd say you can't see the forest because of all the trees.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue with editing your own work. But at the same time, it has to be done sometimes because editing can be, not always, but it can be an expensive venture.
Yeah. That was like in a perfect world, I'd hand it off to somebody, pay them to go through it for me because I know that it's just not something I can do to a level that would satisfy everybody
Yeah,
or satisfy me to a certain extent. It's but I mean, in the world today, I can't afford that. I've got bills to pay,
yeah,
and so it's like I would rather eat than pay for an editor. So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and so it's one of those things. But at the same time, even when I'm editing, I have to go through it like 4 or 5 times, like the same paragraph, and every time I'll find a different mistake
mm,
because when I'm reading it, if I'm not taking that time that I used to have to take, where I have to like process each word, then my brain will automatically fill in what I know is supposed to be there, but whatever came out won't be what I'm reading to myself. It's because like my over the years I've developed this bad habit, for lack of a better word, of processing it in my head and trying to get it out, but that there's that disconnect that just won't let it out. It'll come out jumbled. It'll come out missing words.
mm.
There's been so many times where I'll think I typed up this brilliant paragraph. And I'm like, I'm missing half a sentence here. And it's like, where did that go? And it's, I'm typing fast, and but at points where it's like, okay, that's not typing fast. That's just me skipping
Yeah.
ahead. And because you get so many questions or so many things that you're writing, and it's like, no, I was thinking it through. It wasn't as if I just broke the sentence in my head. It was,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought the whole thing, but didn't quite come out.
You see now this and um how can I put it? There's well, I'm gonna say it's famous, but it's probably not because it's probably something that just keeps cropping up on all my different feeds because there's so many teachers I'm connected to, you know. But there's
Mhm.
this like cartoon, and it just shows an Einstein-esque style teacher sitting at a desk, and it's out of doors, and there's a giraffe, a monkey, a person, a dog, and then there's a small little table, and on top of the table is a bowl, and in the bowl is a fish. And he said, and the teacher guy says, "Okay, everybody, we're going to do a standardized assessment now. All you have to do is I want each of you to climb that tree." And every animal, including the human, is like, "Oh," and the fish is just freaking out, and then the monkey is like, "I got this," you know. And so that's how I kind of view dyslexia sometimes, is asking a fish to climb a tree. It's kind of like, no, 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 no. If we want you to get to the top of the tree, we have other ways of doing it. We can get someone to bring you up there. We can whatever. So like for writing, I'm just thinking like, have you ever tried any other ways of composing and writing, like dictation, for example?
I do that, like, I've tried to do it with like taking notes and stuff when I'm writing. I like I'll be in the car, and like you've seen my TikTok videos, I apparently think a lot in the car.
Like
But I'll
half
be
of
in
my
the
TikToks
car.
are in the car as well. It's fine.
So I'll pull out my phone, and instead of like sometimes I'll just be so excited by the idea I'll sit there and type it, but then I'll have to like go back, edit, and fix my words and stuff because all the little red lines pop up.
Mm,
Okay, that's not right. But either that, or if I'm like actually just taking time to think and waiting on my mom to get out of work or something, I'll pull out the phone and I'll talk and I'll work through the idea. But sometimes I get so rambling when I talk, I it doesn't come out cohesive.
mm.
So it's like I can do that for notes, but to do it when I'm like trying to construct a story, it doesn't. I start going back, and then I'll wait a minute. I want to do that, and I'll have to like fix it. And it's my thought process is too chaotic to actually sit there and dictate the whole book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It does help, and I've realized that also I have a like a I guess self-conscious issue where hearing myself read something out loud, I start getting out of breath with asthma and stuff like that, and so I'm like, okay, this sounds weird, and I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
So I started actually using the like read aloud apps and stuff like that. Like Word has a feature where you can actually just hit a button and it'll read you what you
Mm.
wrote. So I'll do that for my editing sometimes. But those voices, whew, they're so monotonous. It's like, okay, you're gonna put me to
I
sleep.
actually find it very hard to listen to unless it's like high end kind of AI tech, but to listen to a computer and a fake voice read something out, and I'm not dyslexic at all. And so yeah, fair play for being able to do that because I couldn't. I'm just like, wait, where's the full stop? Oh, did she say that right? Oh no, who's that character? You know, I'd just be lost.
No, I actually found it's app. It's like a thing you can put in your kind of like Grammarly, where
Mm,
you can put it on your web page or your computer, and it just will start working for you. It's called Speechify, and
okay.
it's like they have free voices, which are like the robotic tones and stuff. But you can also, I think it's like 11 something, like $11 or something, where if you pay for their premium membership, you can get really good voices. to read anything to you online.
Wow. Okay.
And like I had it on my browser for a while, and I could literally go tweet to tweet on Twitter and have each one read to me. And for my book, I tried it because I was curious what it was like. So I took like the first chapter of my book and put it on a Google Doc because it has to be through the internet.
Hmm.
But I put it on a Google Doc and started having um, this female voice with a British accent read it to me because it's set in London, so I felt right, British accent. And so I had it start reading to me, and I'm like, this sounds so much better than Word. It actually sounded like a human being was talking to me. I was like, this is so much better. So when I finally do get this book finished, I'm going back to Speechify to use that voice to edit with me because I felt like I could actually understand and process what she was saying. I was like, this is golden. Maybe it'll be
Yeah.
better than the last two.
Yeah, and that's what I try to I suppose that's what I was really asking. Like, is there any ways you help the goldfish get to the top of the tree and you're using Speechify? So it's and there's so many options out there, and there's even people who don't have dyslexia. They might find that it works for them as well. But yeah, we could talk about that for the entire interview, but that's not the point. Like, but to do that would be a disservice to you because you're not just a writer with dyslexia. No, I don't want to do that. There was one question though I wanted to run by you about dyslexia, and then we'll put that to bed, I promise. Because you mentioned the word labeled earlier about this. Your dad wasn't too happy with the label of dyslexia, and it's just the reason I'm asking is about this is from my own experience with teaching that I have bumped into parents who, and it's totally the right to, they don't want the word dyslexia uttered in front of their child. They don't want dyslexia to be spoken or whatever, and they just say, look, they have difficulties with reading or difficulties with spelling or writing or whatever. And I'm of the opinion that a label can be a very powerful thing, positive and negative, but for someone that has a learning difficulty, or to branch it out even further, might have a physical disability or a learning disability or whatever. Dyslexia is not a disability, it's a difficulty. I think a label can be really powerful because it names the issue and it says, no, you're not the problem. The dyslexia is the problem. Like with reading, you're not stupid. You're not bad at this. You have an extra speed bump to overcome that other people don't have, and we're going to now work with you and give you those tools now that we know the name of the speed bump. So where do you sit on that argument? Do you think labels are a good thing? Have you had a bad experience with labels, or is it somewhere in between?
It's kind of a mixed bag. For me personally, I think the label definitely helped, like having the label for myself to know this is the problem. That helped, but only when I was old enough to understand what it was.
Oh, okay.
Like because they told me it was dyslexia in like second grade. I
And second
had
grade is like 7, is it?
it's 6 or 7.
Is it it's your
Or,
third year in school, isn't it?
yes,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So it's right around there, and actually it's probably 7 or 8,
Hmm.
and because I was 6 when I went into kindergarten,
Okay.
and then so first grade, second grade. Um, but it was one of those things where it was like, okay, I don't know what that is, so it doesn't like I didn't really pay attention to it. I didn't, but at that time, that's when they started having me do classes, special like they had this thing. It was a program called Basic Skills, which when anybody heard that name implied, or for the bullies of the grade, implied that anybody who took that class was stupid because they needed somebody to tell them the basics of schooling. And so, and then you had all those kids who were labeled the weird kids who were in that class. So it inevitably ended up for the kids who didn't understand what that was and why kids were being pulled out for those specific little refresher courses or whatever you want to call them. Because I was getting pulled out of class, it's like, oh, she must be the weird kid. She must be the stupid one. And so it inevitably ended up people either making snide comments or being out like blunt about it and just calling me stupid or calling me different names and things like that. And like on top of that, I was never an athletic child. I was always the like heavyweight kid in the class. So it just compounded on top of it. And so I got bullied by different kids about my learning abilities, about my weight, about just being that like loner kid because I didn't really have a set of friends in my neighborhood that I went to school with.
Yeah.
All of my friends were just in school with me. And I talked to them and that was it. And I never really had the opportunity when I was younger to like go hang out at somebody's house or go because they were all too far away or I just didn't know where they lived.
Mm.
And so it was a lot of me being that loner kid who, yeah, she's got friends in school, but who is she afterward? Where does she go? And so my friend group always just became very small because it was those people who I knew wouldn't turn around and be like, oh, she's weird or
Yeah.
and try and push me aside. And so like at the time that just became dyslexia, like knowing it was dyslexia became that like that's a problem, but I don't have a concept of what it is. I
Yeah.
just know that whatever it is causing all of this bad stuff.
So it's like for you, yeah, I see what you mean when you say you have a complicated relationship with labels, because in a way it says here's why you have these problems, but then having the label created new problems essentially.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
because
unfortunate. I'm sorry you went through that because that's not fair, and it's horrible because I know from my own experience I went through a lot of bullying as well. Like I was in three different in Ireland. We have a two school system. We have a three school. So instead of elementary, middle, and high school, we have primary and secondary. So primary school is like all of elementary with, we'd say, half of middle school, and then secondary is the other half of middle school and all of high school. And plus a year because we here we stay in school longer because maybe we're stupid or who knows. Uh, um, but I went to three different primary schools, so essentially three different elementary schools, because my parents were moving and stuff. And every school I had issues, like people picking on me and name calling and all that kind of thing. So I know it's children can be unbearably cruel, but it's because they don't have any empathy and they don't understand that their feelings that they experience are equal to the feelings of everyone else around them, and vice versa. That like, so when somebody called you stupid, they weren't thinking, or when they called me queer or worse, like they didn't think, well, how would I feel if someone called me that, because that's what I've just done to Connor and to Chelsea, you know. And it's, I suppose that's, to be honest, that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about teaching, because I'm just like, I want to find those kids and be like, oi, cop on. No.
actually, for the longest time, I did want to be a teacher too,
Yeah.
for a similar reason. I wanted to be that person who,
Who wasn't there for you.
yeah, I wanted to be that teacher who came in and was like, it's okay.
Mm.
You're not less than because of this.
Mm.
And ironically, it was because of one of my college professors that I chose not to, because she got very blunt about it, and she knew that I had self-confidence issues because I wasn't really a talker. I had the problems that I did. And we sat down because she was, I mean, I had her for 2 classes at that point. And so it was my freshman year, first semester, she was my English teacher. Second semester, I had her again. And so she sat me down and she asked me, she says, "What do you want to do with your English degree?" Like, because I had already talked to her about like being an English major. And I told her I wanted to be a teacher.
Hmm.
And she basically said, "Well, are you prepared for what comes with that?" And the idea that you would have to be up in front of a class full of those kids who can be quite cruel
Oh, yeah.
and write something on the board and potentially spell it wrong and have them tear you apart for it.
Hmm.
Or have another teacher make a comment on it, or some like have essentially have my difficulties on display
Yeah.
in front of all these people. And I didn't like of course, when she said this to me. So it just was a very heavy dose of reality for how I process things. And I started thinking about it and was like, yeah, I don't think I could handle getting in front of a high because I the way I am with the things that I wanted to teach and stuff like that, and the subjects that I would have preferred to handle, it would have had to have been high school or college level
Okay.
like classes that I wanted to teach. So it wasn't like I could go into like a little kids with like second grade and third grade and teach
Hmm.
those classes. It was I'd be in a class with people old enough to know that I did something wrong on the board,
Yeah.
or old enough to recognize the teacher's supposed to know better, kind of thing. And so I was like, yeah, I don't think I can do that. So I inevitably decided that I didn't want to be a teacher because of that. And part of me is happy that I didn't go that route
Hmm.
because I did avoid that potential problem. But at the same time, for the longest time, I wanted to be that teacher for somebody.
Yeah.
And so I do feel that moment of like, I missed out on that opportunity to help a kid who's going through something that I did. And so it's still one of those things that's like, do I go back to school and do it again? Or
What can
do
I
I
do?
just, yeah,
Yeah.
because especially when you're not a teacher or in publishing, an English degree really doesn't give you many opportunities.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, the way Ursinus handled it and the way their curriculum is set up, Ursinus being the college that I went to,
Yeah.
they it's a very well-rounded education, and they make sure you cover all the bases, all the different courses, and
But
it
your degree
really
is still one thing at the end of the day, no matter what you
exactly.
actually did. Yeah.
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 It's like I can do all of this stuff and I have all of this knowledge and all these little things that I picked up while I was there. But when somebody sees my degree, all they see is English.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And they don't see the fact that an English degree can teach you to like analyze what you're reading, can teach you to create like cohesive stories and like to advertise and
Yeah.
all these
So
different things
much in
that
there.
are, yeah, it could apply to almost anything. But because it's not specifically a business degree or a marketing degree or something like that, people look at it and they're like, "How'd you do that? Why
Yeah.
aren't you teaching? Why aren't you like
Yeah.
a librarian or something like directly related to reading or writing?" And so it's one of those
But
things that's
but
just,
you did go into writing though. Like
well,
you know,
yeah.
that's the truth. So I know like I know that you have wordplay which came out in oh God, I wrote down the year 2017, I
Yeah.
think. It was your book of poetry. And then, of course, you a few years later, the first of the Devereux Witches stories and books came out. So, what is it about witches and the supernatural and the paranormal that draws you in as a writer? Like, why write about that when you can write about literally anything?
Well, I like when I was talking about the film and how I loved watching those.
Do you
I
remember what
liked
film that first movie was, by the way? I meant to ask you that.
it was either it was a Disney film. It was either I think it was either Pocahontas or Aladdin. Those
Okay.
were like one of the first two that I saw. And because it had just come out in theaters, so it was whichever one had just come out like that year or right around then. And I remember those are still to this day two of my favorites. And ever since I'm still in that little kid in the seat when I go to the movies where I'm just staring up the screen. And like God help the person who makes noise by me in the movie theater.
That's when the teacher within you comes out and you just like you start getting
Exactly. My poor mom, she'll come, she and I will go, and if she gets bored or falls asleep during the movie and starts snoring, she gets, she's done that to me a couple times, and it's just like, okay, no, not gonna happen. So I'll like nudge her arm, and what I think is just like tapping her awake is like, wake up. And she like jumps and she gets so mad at me when I do that. Like, you're falling asleep during a movie we paid for. And then there's the people who, of course, talk to you like you're across, like scream at you like you're across the room when you're sitting next to them in the movie theater. And it's just like, okay, I get you're having a conversation, but it's called a whisper.
And turn it down. So
Yeah.
tell me a bit about the Devereux Witches then and where that came from.
Well, the Devereux Witches started. Like I have, so the Devereux Witches are going to eventually end up being at least 9 books. I may
Oh,
extend.
was that all? Okay.
I'm gonna. It's essentially 3 different trilogies that I'm starting with. I
Yeah.
may extend one of the stories a little further, but the first book in that series that I actually drafted to like a full manuscript was the first book of the series that I'm going to publish last,
Oh,
which
okay. That's that dyslexia brain making you do things in a
yeah,
different order.
I essentially wrote that book first, and then I went back to the second trilogy, which would be Wicked Raven, or what turned into Wicked Raven, and then I wrote the one that came first, which was Eyes of the Grave. And so it's just kind of like, okay, go back to the beginning, and now we publish them.
But that's interesting because now you know when you're writing the second and third books of all the trilogies, you know where you're going, especially when you're doing the first trilogy, you know what you're building towards. So does that make writing, we'll say trilogy one, book two, does that make writing that book a little bit easier because you know where you have to get to?
Well, that's the funny thing because a lot of what happened in that first book, I actually have changed.
Hmm.
So it because I can't stick to anything apparently. I started I wrote it all out. I started editing it and then I was so bogged down by all the editing that I had to do for it that I just started like I couldn't look at it anymore. I sent it off to my cousin. I asked her to look at it because I couldn't look at it. I hated it.
Hmm.
So I was just like, you know what? I gotta put it on the back burner, work on a different idea. So I started working on a different idea. And at the time they weren't connected and like that character, her name was Devereaux, but she wasn't a witch. She's actually a Valkyrie. And like it was so separate from the other idea that I was working on. But as I started working on that second idea, I realized just like the magic system I'm using is so similar between the two of them that it has to be the same world.
Okay, cool.
And then I started looking at things like um, Anne Rice and looking at like family history, like books that have like built-in family histories that are just enormous.
Hmm.
And then there's other books like the Shadowhunter series by Cassandra Clare,
Yeah,
where they're essentially three separate, or three or four at this point, separate series, but they're all the same universe.
yeah, they're all linked. Yeah.
And like characters will cross over. And so it's just like, I like that idea. I like the family history angle and I like the crossovers.
Hmm.
So it all just kind of started coming together into this wall of a story. And I was like, well, how would,
What you're working on now, like it's kind of like bringing it all together. That's brilliant.
yeah,
It's and just when you were describing it there, I kind of thought like, um, that's one thing that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is praised for, the MCU, that it is this one huge story told through feature length movies all across the way. And it's kind of like books have been doing that for years.
exactly.
Hi, we've been here the whole time. So it's just kind of funny to see it kind of like lauded as this amazing, brilliant thing. And it's kind of like, yeah, that's old
Like,
news.
I
We know.
can show
We
you
know.
a shelf of people who do that.
I can show you a shelf of one author who does that. Like it's not a huge deal.
Um,
Um, Chelsea, we're kind of coming up on time, so I'm going to just ask you my last couple of questions, if that's okay. So, when this interview is over and I've stopped record and we've had a wee chat and said our goodbyes, what's the first thing you're going to do today?
um, First thing I'm going to do is either work on this puzzle. Honestly, it's a puzzle that I got. It's a Critical Role puzzle.
I saw you
It's
tweeting about it.
a thousand pieces, and I forgot that apparently I hate puzzles. Um, because I within like 5 minutes of starting it, I had a major headache. But I'm finally to the point where I can actually see the progress of it.
Okay. Yeah,
I
yeah,
was like, okay, now I gotta finish it.
yeah.
Now that I can actually see the faces of the characters and stuff, I was like, now I have to finish it. But
Is it a mighty?
I
This is going to be a question that very few of my listeners are going to know what I'm on about. Is it a Vox Machina or a Mighty Nine puzzle?
Vox Machina.
Okay, cool. Right.
Because they just came out with another shirt, and so I was like, okay, I want to get the shirt and the puzzle, and so I bought them both, and I opened the puzzle, and I was like, I forgot how many pieces, a thousand pieces
Yeah,
is.
thousands a lot.
I was like, I forgot how big this would be. So it literally had, because I had this like little, have this tray table that I thought would be enough. Because apparently I can't measure anything because I measured it and it's like 2 inches short on both sides.
Oh no.
So I had to get like this big piece of cardboard to sit on top of the tray table that
Oh,
I'm putting a puzzle on. And it's just one of those things where it's like I'm staring at these little pieces for too long.
you can't see the puzzles for the pieces. You can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
We've come full
Exactly.
circle. um, so what do you have any goals or any big aspirations that have nothing to do with writing that you're like, oh, that'd be great if I could get that? Just one little quick one.
Um, Probably. Hmm. I mean, it does technically have to do with writing, but
That's okay too.
I would like to see some kind of story that I've made become. It doesn't have to be like one of my books or a short story, but like see something made into a film
Yeah.
or film or TV, as the case may be. But to see something like that, like see people acting out my words and see the faces and have it all come together on the screen, which started my love of story. That would be the ultimate dream for me.
Yeah. And it'd be great, like full circle as well,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't it? So my second last question is a very important one. Where can people find you online and where can they find your books? Your story and your
Well,
stories and your poetry.
well, my Twitter handle, essentially, the at the Writing Druid, is what I use for everything. You can find me on Facebook as the Writing Druid. Find me on Pinterest, TikTok, Twitter, obviously, Instagram, and
Everywhere.
essentially any social media that I can access. That's the
That's
name that I use. Um, just
That's your
again,
website name too, isn't it? Is
yes,
it
it is
thewritingdruid.com or just writingdruid.com?
the Writing
The
Druid.
Writing Druid. Brilliant. And then I'm sure links to all your books are on your website, I know.
Yes.
And for anyone listening, you're going to find all the links in the I don't know why I'm pointing down. This is an audio podcast mostly. Like 10 people watch it, but you'll find it in the show notes, guys. You know the drill at this stage. And then my final question for you today, Chelsea, is what was the last book you read?
I'm actually in the middle of Six of Crows by Lee Bardugo, in honor of the show coming out, the Shadow and Bone show coming out on Netflix. I had read Shadow and Bone a while ago, never continued the series just because the author made some choices that I wouldn't make. And so, but I reread that, and then I was going to read Six of Crows because they actually combined the two books for the first season, and I wanted to know about these other characters that were getting shoved into the story. So it's really good. It's a lot better than the other book, in my opinion. But
That's okay.
um, yeah.
Chelsea, thank you so much for coming on to the show and telling me your story and telling all of us your story. And we got so in depth in like your experience with dyslexia and all that kind of thing that I feel like I've done you a disservice because there's so much more. I mean, you saw the questions I sent it to you. There were so many more questions I was going to ask you, but time is a thing. It keeps moving onwards, unfortunately. So thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's been great to get to know you.
Yeah, it's been great. It's fun.